This is a pretty special episode. It's one I've been setting up for a little while, and I think you are really going to enjoy it. So I'm starting, instead of the usual cold open, cheeky cut from the interview. I'm just going to begin quickly with a little bit of a rant and a call to action, I guess. I think that's the name for it. So I was thinking about conferences this summer. Joanna is going to Sewanee. She's going to the Sewanee Writers Conference in August. So if any of you are planning to go or planning to apply, go hang out with my wife, who will be just slamming back tequila moderately and responsibly down at the French House. But I will be here with the girls. So I won't be going to Sewanee. But I was thinking I might at least see about going to Poetry by the Sea or Westchester. I went to Westchester, a decade ago. I've never been to Poetry by the Sea. If any of you know about those or have a recommendation, or I know they sometimes feud with each other, or they used to at least, give me a heads up. Maybe I'll see somebody there. So I was looking, though, the applications aren't up for either of them, but I was looking at one of them, and I noticed that on the general requirements listed, I may have been seeing this wrong. I may have been reading it wrong. I hope I was making a mistake. I hope I was reading it wrong. But it looked like one of the things they require is 3 letters of recommendation. And it made me think about letters of recommendation. I've written a fair number of letters of recommendation. I've certainly requested and gotten lots of letters of recommendation from teachers and mentors and bosses in the past. Any academic application requires letters of recommendation. Lots of writerly, certainly poetry, concerned applications require letters of recommendation, often multiple, often 3. 3 is a kind of a magic number for a lot of applications in this world. And there are some, sometimes universities will set up a dossier where you'll have several letters all collected together, and you can have them sent out with applications. You just pay your dossier service, a regular sum of money, and they will keep these letters and send them out. Of course, the letters get dated. Yeah, you do have to replenish them. Sometimes certain jobs or applications or gigs or awards will have specific requirements, or you end up needing a new letter of recommendation from a new person or somebody who's more relevant to this particular arena. And it just got me thinking about how in our age of heightened concern for egalitarianism, for equality, for fair play, it's fucking unbelievable that we still have letters of recommendation. Unbelievable. There's no excuse for it. There really isn't. I mean, let me say this. I am an upper middle class, white, well-educated male with, I'm not very connected, but I know a fair number of people. I've had a lot of teachers. I've had a dossier service in the past. As letters of recommendation go, I have resources. I can hustle up some letters of recommendation if ever I need them. But I fucking hate to do it. I hate it. And I don't do it anymore. Years ago I stopped because it's too awful and stupid and ridiculous. It's just too much of a fucking burden. It sucks. Basically, an application that requires 3 letters of recommendation is like an application that requires you to go kick 3 of your friends in the balls and just say, hey, I have some homework I'd like you to do so that I might get this thing. Fucking inexcusable. Because just think for a second, if it is easy for anyone to get a letter of recommendation, it's easy for me. But that's not the case for most people. I mean, for somebody of a different class, of a different race, of a different set of circumstances, different resources, different connections, different background, different education, it can become an insane obstacle. And there's one reason. We all know there's one actual reason that people ask for letters of recommendation. Because, of course, every letter of recommendation effectively says the same thing, which is a superlative thumbs up for the person applying. And so all that really matters is whether you can get a letter of recommendation from somebody who is a big fucking deal. Not a kind of big deal, not like, oh, I've heard of him, a big deal. If you can get a dispositive letter of recommendation from a big, whomping, major figure, then maybe that makes the difference. Otherwise, all it's saying is you have enough resources to be able to annoy 3 of your friends so that into doing you this favor. Again, because of course it's not an every so often favor. If you are in this world and you're constantly applying for things, it's all the fucking time. So that is what it's measuring. And nobody fucking wants to read these letters of recommendation. Most people don't ever read them. They ask for them and then don't read them. And we all know the actual reason they're asking is just to create a hurdle. It's to create red tape. It's deliberately making the process a little bit more difficult so that fewer people apply. The purpose of the letter of recommendation is to require those arbitrating the decision. It's to require the people deciding on who gets the thing applied for. The purpose is to require them to read fewer applications. That's the only fucking reason people ask for letters of recommendation. I used to apply for a lot of academic jobs years ago, and there was one academic job I ever applied for that I thought had a decent and honest application process. I didn't get the fucking job. James Arthur got the job. Good poet, good person, good teacher. He deserved it. But the application process was this: a 1-page cover letter and your book. That's what was required. Send in a 1-page cover letter and your book, and we'll get back to you. That's fair. That's legitimate. In fact, honestly, if it's for academic jobs, maybe in the case of actual jobs, not 1-year posts, not awards, for a job, it's legitimate to ask for references. That is, phone numbers of people you can call if you're interested. It's legitimate to ask for references. It's legitimate to ask for a 1-page cover letter. It's legitimate to ask for a writing sample. And that's fucking it. It really is. I'm not a big stirring up the the feverish masses kind of guy. I'm not really into mass outrage. But man, I would have a hard time not supporting a call to cancel fucking letters of recommendation. I mean, if I hate them, then people for whom they are actually a real burden should really hate them. Fuck that. No more letters of recommendation. And Poetry by the Sea, Westchester Poetry Conference. Those of you who've gone to either of those lately, let me know what you think about them. But I'll tell you this. If they require a letter of fucking recommendation, fuck that. Poetry by the Sea, everybody involved with that, everybody involved with Westchester, God bless you. I know many of you well, and I wish you well. And I have nothing but reverence and fondness for the ghost of Kim Bridgeford. But if you want a letter of recommendation, you can go fuck yourself. All of which is to say, what I actually meant to start with was an invitation. So Sleeve Rickets is it's growing slowly a little bit, but it's getting a little bigger and a little more demanding. So Sleeve Rickets is now looking for an intern. This is specifically a social media intern. If you have any interest, send 3 letters of recommendation. Don't send a letter of recommendation. Send the names of 3 podcasts you like and 3 poems you like to sleeverickets@gmail.com. There's no money right now, but I actually would like to amend that as things go along. I should say, if you are somebody for whom a silly social media internship that does not pay any money is going to fuck you up financially, write me anyway. Just write me. Don't not write for that reason. Write me a note anyway. Send me 3 podcasts you like and 3 poems you like. And no fucking letters of recommendation to sleeverickets@gmail.com. And I promise that if you ever try to start an unpaid podcast social media intern union, then I definitely won't hire Duke Energy goons to come burn down your company-owned hovel. Now let's get to the fucking show. As I said, this is going to be a good one. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening. Thank you especially to those of you who've had a chance to recommend the show to somebody you think might like it. This is one you might want to recommend because I have got a really, really special guest this week. I don't think I am insulting any of my previous guests if I say that this is by far my most distinguished guest. Today I am speaking with Mary Jo Salter, the author of some baker's dozen of books, I think 8 or 9 of them collections of poetry, including the now available for pre-order collection Zoom Rooms. That everything I have heard or read from it is very good. She is gonna read one little poem from it at the end. But she's very generously and good-naturedly agreed to come on today, not just to talk about her own poetry, but to talk about a curious and provocative essay by Carmine Starnino that appeared in the New Criterion back in April, called "What Might Have Been," and it is all about what Starnino calls counterfactual poetry anthologies. In addition to being a distinguished professor, a beloved mentor, and a prolific poet and author, Mary Jo is also the co-editor of the last 3 editions of the Norton Anthology of Poetry. She was in charge of the most recent 2 centuries of poetry, if memory serves. And she knows a shitload about anthologizing. So she's come on as my anthology expert to talk about this Starnino essay. It's one I've been thinking about for a while, and it's one I think we have a lot of arguments with the essay. I will say it's certainly worth reading. I'll include links, obviously, to everything in the show notes. I will also say Carmine, who I do know Carmine Starnino a little bit. He's edited some of my work in the past. Carmine, if you hear this, come tell us what we got wrong. Come on the show, or just come on the show and complain about somebody else's fucking essay. But thank you for writing this, and I hope you all enjoy my conversation with Mary Jo Salter as we pull it to fucking ribbons.
That's part of what creativity is. And so I think what's interesting about Starnino's take on anthologies is he's saying that in some cases people are taking anthologies not so much as a record of what inarguably was, but a record of what might have been.
Right.
It was all written, what the poems that somebody puts into an unsuccessful anthology and the poems, different poems that someone puts into a successful one, those poems were all written. And the question is, what are the standards that went into making that anthology? And so in some sense, I guess I'm getting back to this word counterfactual. I'm not convinced it's the right word for a very interesting subject.
Yeah, it does seem as if there's a little bit of a conflation across a few different types of anthologies, because he talks about he starts with this Peter Van Torn anthology that never was, that is counterfactual in another sense, that it doesn't exist, but it was.
Well, it existed, but it wasn't published.
Right. It's true. Yeah, of course. It was put together, but it was not published. And that's part of what I guess makes an anthology an anthology. It's not that the poems weren't there before, it's that they weren't presented with this prominence, in this particular way. But Van Torn's goal with this book Mainstream that he completed in 1973, that was declined for publication, was to compile an alternative to Canadian poetic history, that he was sort of saying, rather than he basically, as at least in Sarnino's framing, tries to ignore the poetry that had been prominent in Canada and set forth this different tradition and say, well, this is what Canadian poetry is. And that seems like related somewhat. So he talks later on, and I do the same thing you do, where I have to print things out, and then often I will print them out, and then I will retype sections of them so that I can see them.
Right.
But he talks about Yeats' anthology, the Oxford Book of Modern Verse, and he talks about Rita Dove's
very famous,
Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry in 2011. And in both of those cases, he sort of mentions that there was some displeasure that people had about various people that they left out. That both of those were meant to be sort of historical, official, factual anthologies, and they, because of the taste or the prejudice of the editor, they left out kind of what should have been important inclusions. And that seems related to the Van Torn anthology, but different from, say, he cites as counterfactual Donald Allen's anthology, a number of sort of alternative tradition anthologies. I thought of the Michael Robbins essay Riposte, which is on the Paul Hoover postmodern American poetry anthology.
I must have read it, but it isn't coming up to mind. 10 I know that anthology, though.
Yeah. But his observation was that there's a little bit of a sleight of hand being performed by this kind of anthology, which is maybe different from Donald Allen, who was saying, here are all the poems being ignored. Here's the new other poetry. What Paul Hoover's anthology is saying, according to Robbins, is here is the ignored tradition, the alternative tradition, the other tradition. And Robbins' really only observation is, well, that's actually the mainstream. That is what Charles Bernstein once called official poetry, official verse culture, but it is what has always styled itself as avant-garde or as revolutionary. And it seems like there's sort of a few different things happening here, where Sarnino has this idea of a kind of it seems in some ways like the Van Torn anthology is the only true example of what he's thinking of as a counterfactual anthology. It's not just here are my favorite poems. It's not just here are some good poems and I left out some things that I don't like. It's here is what I assert is the main historical thrust of poetry, while knowing that it's actually not, that it's something else.
Right. And so it seems to me that the number one criterion for any anthology that anyone's putting together is define your terms, define your goal, right? Mm-hmm. So what are you attempting to do? Are you attempting to show some of the other strands of poetry during a certain period that you feel were underrepresented? You have your opportunity to write an introductory essay. You get to say that, right? Or are you saying, I had my graduate students last semester put together what we call personal anthologies. And I specifically said, this is not about what you believe is historically necessarily important, or what is, in any kind of received way, the best. This is simply what you love, and it's a way to find out, what is my taste? Why do I love these things? So
like a commonplace book, kind of, people used to call
it. In a sense, I hadn't thought of that, but it's a useful way of thinking about it. In other words, I make no excuses. This is what makes my hair stand on end. This is what gives me goosebumps. And I had a student who just couldn't even begin to say how important Gerard Manley Hopkins is to him. So it does for him what Emily Dickinson does for me. And you get into this problem where at first being told come up with 10 to 12 of these seems daunting, and then you realize what's daunting is that you just came up with 200 favorites, right? But in a case of something like, for example, the Norton Anthology of Poetry, which I have co-edited 3 times, once in the 90s, once in the 2010s and the 2000s, and once in the 2010s. At no point was I under any illusion, nor were my co-editors, that we were making an anthology of our own greatest hits,
right.
our own favorites. Of course, many of them were, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to give an overview of what was historically significant, and within that, and be balanced about history to some degree. And then within that, to choose our own favorites, because we are ultimately, we are subjective beings, and why shouldn't we be? Whereas something like the Paul Hoover anthology or many others that are very specific, they're trying to do something that they're not saying that more conventional or more often received poets aren't any good. They're just saying, here's what you haven't been reading. Right. And so it's hard for me to say, because I've never seen the Van Toorn anthology or his introduction. I don't know whether he was saying more, here's what I wish you would read, or whether he was actually kind of engaging in a form of propaganda. This is already a big deal, and I'm just representing what is already a big deal.
I mean, it seems, at least based on Carmine's characterization of it, that he says, trendier anecdotal styles were now being adopted, styles Van Toorn dismissed as laziness on a typewriter.
Yes.
As he saw it, poetry was an art of the senses. It flourished best and enjoyed its most exceptional breakthroughs when you fixed your eyes on the world and found words precise enough to evoke it. How to make others see that too. And so it does seem like he at least believed that his favorites or his taste was being ignored. And I think it even notes that there were a couple of notable inclusions of already well-known poems, but mostly they were sort of startling, out of left field selections. So it does seem like, I mean, if the Norton is maybe at least for American poetry anthologies, like, I mean, it's the factual anthology that comes to mind. He even refers to it offhand, just like as one end of a spectrum. Like it is a factual anthology. As you said, your taste is maybe it is on the list, but at the bottom of the list of your qualifications to edit it. Right. Yeah. There are a lot of other things that come before your own preference.
That's right.
And so he does seem to be. I mean, it seems like what Van Toorn is doing, at least as the essay presents it, and what Starnino's even advocating or endorsing, is propaganda, is a partisan approach to anthologizing. I mean, he says that anthologists should not set aside, an anthology can wield vastly more influence when it doesn't adjust for bias, but instead embraces it. He says,
go ahead. Sorry. No, I was just going to say, we'll have much more influence, right? See, that in itself is a big statement about what Starnino and or Van Toorn want, in the sense that they're saying, I wish to shape the taste of others. And I don't mean that most anthologists don't have that as part of why they're doing their work. But I think what's interesting about what Starnino is proposing or reporting on and then proposing is that comes to the fore, the idea that I am going to be a teacher, essentially. I'm going to teach the reading public what it has been missing by reading all of these lazy anecdotal poems, and I'm going to instruct them on how their taste can be improved. And teachers do that, but it's, ideally, it seems to me, how do I say this? I mean, can you go back to what you were quoting before I interrupted you?
I can. He says, first, an anthology can wield vastly more influence when it doesn't adjust for bias, but instead embraces it. Second, that influence springs from an editor's readiness to impose his will on a body of work, to perform the dissent, as it were, using other people's poems. Of course, even the most diligently nonpartisan anthology is a form of criticism. Poets are overestimated or underestimated or misrepresented in ways that turn them into other kinds of poets, or at least versions that don't exist anywhere else. So he does talk about a dissent as like, I think of like the Supreme Court, like there are anthologies of decision and there are anthologies of dissent. And he's sort of proposing that you set forth an anthology of dissent as if it were an anthology of decisions.
But you have to honor the sophistication of your reader. And even if your reader doesn't know as much about poetry as you do, they are come to these poems and they shouldn't be lied to that these are famous poems if they're not, right? But there was something else you said, that we are going to be presenting poets not exactly as they were, even in more traditional anthologies. And that is very true. And the example that the main reason, in my experience, is that anthologies, in order to be relatively even-handed and not give too many pages to even the big stars or too many pages to certain periods, will favor shorter lyrics rather than long pieces. I had a funny letter from somebody, a reader, to the first time I edited the Norton, and I had taken out a little bit of the Robinson Jeffers and that my predecessor had in. And this reader wrote to me and said, "You're obviously, trying to obliterate Jeffers from, the tradition. You really, he's the greatest 20th century poet, and you really should include all of his work." And I've been told that I should have included all of Leaves of Grass, that I should have included all of the Prelude. People really don't understand that the nature of a comprehensive anthology, even if it isn't 2,000 pages, but 2,000 pages is the most you can have before the binding falls apart. So if that's your goal, 2,000 pages, and perforce, you have to misrepresent Walt Whitman and William Worth and a lot of other people. You can't give the whole thing. And on the other hand, we did have a rule after we did this together the first time. I was working with the same people, that if we only had one poem by a poet that we wanted to put in, the assumption should be that we can't put that poet in. If you can't find two poets that you think two poems by this poet that you think are worth being in the anthology, then they're not get in. And that was a good rule of thumb that especially because we made exceptions. There were some people who just wrote one marvelous thing and you got to put it in there.
Right.
But those are the sort of the two ways in which poets, I think, can be misrepresented that have to do with scale.
Oh, yeah. That totally makes sense. And I know Ryan, who's done a little bit of anthologizing as well, has said that one element that people never give enough attention to that limits anthologists is cost. That some of these poems they don't all cost the same amount, and there's certain poets where you can only include so much because you can't afford to include anymore.
Oh, that's so true. And it's more true every year. And fortunately, Norton never said to us, you can't have that poet because of the cost. But in the years that I worked on the book, the cost more than doubled. And so the part that I and one other editor was in charge of, which is 1800 to the present, anything by anybody who was out, it was not in the public domain. Anybody past, I don't know what year it was, but 1920 something. Suddenly you had to really think about, you would not not include someone because they were expensive, but you
Right.
did have to think about what will the total cost of the book be.
Oh yeah, there was some. I want to say it was Helen Gardner. That I don't think the dates are
Mhm.
right for that, but there's some. I mean, I love her. I love her Oxford Book of English Verse, partly because it has no table of contents, so you can only. It's like it has to be a
You
commonplace
must
book.
browse.
Yeah, you have to
Yeah.
page through it. But I think she, or maybe it may be a different anthology I'm thinking of. They presented the principle that you solve some of the problem of sifting, as he calls it, sifting through what's valuable out of contemporary verse. You solve that problem by just including nothing from the previous 50 years. That was the standard, which seems like it would at least make the copyright prices go, costs go down a little bit. Make something simpler.
They would. The problem with that is that increasingly, if you are using anthologies in college courses,
Right.
Increasingly, it's not just the students but the teachers who want the latest thing.
Yeah.
And it's harder and harder and harder to get somebody to read Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? So
Yeah.
that is part of the problem.
Of course.
Yeah.
I do wonder, because I mean there are a few questions that start. I mean, obviously he's chosen a focus for his essay, and I think it's a really worthwhile read. I have a kind of a theory about it. Maybe I'll pitch later, but there are a couple of questions he doesn't examine in I think quite enough depth. One of these is the question of representation of poems versus poets, and I wonder, apart from that kind of two poem rule, especially for you dealing with the Norton has an eye to history, as you said. It's not, it matters what has been historically significant. That's something that you have to take into account. I wonder how you think about the question of representing a poet versus representing poems, because I do.
Yeah.
I think there is that there are sort of one-hit wonders, or at least pseudo one-hit wonders, where it's like one that's amazing and then some others that are pretty good.
Right.
But even beyond that, I wonder about whether you have to choose ever between the poems that sort of most characterize this poet and the poems that you think are finest, or I don't know. I'm not sure how
Yes, it's a really interesting question. What is most representative of a poet's whole career may not necessarily allow for your printing the very best thing that you think they ever wrote. And one way around that is a different kind of anthology. I know you must know this whole series of everyman poetry anthologies where they'll have like poems about birds, poems about Paris.
Yeah.
My friend Carl Kirchway did one recently called Poems of Healing, which was just wonderful. And in those cases, it's very rare you would have two poems by the same person. You're choosing a theme, you're allowing yourself a great range, not only of time, but also we can get into this question of whether you want to allow translated poems, and he chose to do that. But you don't need, you could certainly have an entire book of poems. You could reproduce an entire book by a poet about healing, for example. Certainly there are good examples of that, but the aspiration of the anthology is just obviously different, and you feel good about that. You're not representing careers, you're representing poems.
Yeah, that kind of anthology, particularly because those tend to be pretty slender. At least I have one or two of them.
Yes, they're really small format. They're really meant to be kind of pocket anthologies,
right? Or like a mixtape. It's like you could sit down and read through them in a sitting, and it's that. Yeah, it's sort of when you've arranged an experience, or it's like an evening of entertainment. So the way they used to say
exactly, yeah. And I think that the gigantism of anthologies is necessary. But there's another way to do it. And I like that. And in that way, you're not being counterfactual. You're not saying all poems are about birds. You're saying, I have an interest in birds. And I'm noticing there are a whole lot of great poems about birds. So here they are.
One of the other questions, I think maybe the biggest question that doesn't quite get, I think, as much attention as it could in a different essay here, is the question of what exactly anthologies do. That
Mhm.
he talks about them as if they, we said, set the taste or determine the culture, or they affect readers in one way or another. But it does seem like it's not quite clear what he thinks they do. And I'm curious, for you, who has so much experience with that, what you think anthologies should do, or what they actually do, what effect they have, apart from the best intentions of the anthologists.
It's a really good question. I think it is rarer and rarer to courses in college where you really are with Cadman's hymn and you go all the way to Tracy Smith. It's much more the case today that you're going to take a short historical period and or a theme. And so I hope that one of the things that bigger anthologies do, more comprehensive anthologies do, is remind you that there's more than you can absorb, that even though you're taking a class, the class is really called life, and that you're buying this book because you're going to be dipping into it from time to time in a rare way after you've had the guidance of a teacher to tell you what he or she thinks is the best. But, it's impossible to absorb big historical anthologies in anything like a sitting, or anything like a year, or anything like 5 years. And so I think that's one thing that anthologies can do. And they teach you what your own taste is. If you keep going back to particular poems or particular poets, you're learning, mostly unconsciously, but eventually a little more consciously, what do I like? Yeah. Why do I like that? What does that make me think of? And then you get to, if you've had those kinds of thoughts, maybe you're even asking yourself, what is poetry for? Why am I reading this? What is that thing? What are poems? So you begin with the sense of being overwhelmed by history and by the seeming erudition of whoever put it together. And finally you get down to, who am I? What do I like? And what is a poem?
Yeah, no, that I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that makes some sense. That, it almost as a mirror of your personal anthology assignment, that there's it's almost like one of those, when you go to the doctor and you get an allergy test, they prick you with a bunch of different things to see which ones set off a reaction.
That's a good analogy. I really like that. Yeah.
You may find that you didn't expect to respond to this or that, but this is what gets you.
It works in the negative sense too. I have allergies to certain poets. I'm not going to name them, but I definitely do.
Yeah, no, and I got a heavy dose of some of those as an undergrad, and I've been scared off from them since. Do you know the Borges short story Tlon Akbar or Orbis Tertius? I think it was his first one. Not offhand,
no. I've read it. I don't remember.
It was. I think it was the first piece of fiction he published, but it's a typical kind of convoluted Borges story. But the basic idea is that this cabal of geniuses over the centuries has sort of slowly put together this master encyclopedia of a whole world that does not exist.
Oh, yes.
And then they release a volume of it into the world, and it sets off these ripples. People begin, and it feels like reading this essay, it feels like that's sort of what Starnino dreams of.
That's a really good analogy. Yeah.
Anthology, which is beautiful, but also, I don't know how much anthologies do that. I mean, it also just makes me wonder about what, apart from like intersections with actual history, what it means for poetry, or a certain type of poetry to be prominent, or to be, often that means nothing more than what's the case for this stretch of 50 years at a time. Because your anthology stretches over all this time. You have a slightly smaller stretch of that you're in charge of, but you have to have this awareness with your co-anthologist that within this great span, various of these poets have risen and fallen in and out of even, view at different times.
Right. And I'm so grateful to people who nudge me and say, have you read so-and-so? There's John Wyeth Allen, who's the American poet who wrote sonnets while on the front in France in World War I. I'd never heard of him. And Dana Gioia put out an anthology of, a collection of his poems. And it was because of that, that I discovered. And so this person isn't prominent, and he's not prominent now either. But it is wonderful to think that even though people sometimes fall into complete darkness, that they can be brought up into at least a little bit of light. But you're talking about prominent poems. This is an aside, but I hope an amusing one. I was at the hairdresser today, and
looks very nice.
Thank you very much. And I was reading a book by Mark Strand, a book of his stories, Mr. and Mrs. Baby, while stuff was on my head, and my hairdresser was watching something on his phone. It's a one-man shop, so it was just the two of us in the place, and he was laughing just with such delight at whatever it was that he was watching, and he said, "You have to see this." He's following somebody on TikTok who shows herself being threatened by some bird that lives inside her house, is constantly trying to peck at her, and she says witty things about this bird while it tries to kill her. And she does it all the time, and people watch it. And I wish I could remember what her name is. And I said to him, trying to be, neutral as I could, like, why do you think people follow it, or how do people start following that? And he said, well, somebody on Facebook posted it and I followed it, and now I'm addicted to her and I follow her all the time. And then he said, she has almost 500,000 followers.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, and I held up Mark Strand's book and I said, he is a famous poet, and I would guess that this little book of his short stories did not sell more than 10,000 copies. And I said, if I ever sold a book, and I published a book and it sold 10,000 copies, I would be the happiest poet in the world. I said, so here's this woman in her living room with this bird. It was a turkey. I don't know what it was. Kept trying to peck at her, and 500,000 people are following. So I know that's definitely an aside, but I'm just trying to keep current about what it means to be a prominent poet.
That anecdote is both alarming and heartening, I would say, in that it's just one more reminder of how insignificant poetry is in our culture. But what I like about what your hairdresser said about this woman is that he was exposed to it and he liked it, and that's why he followed it. And that's something that it doesn't really it gets mentioned a couple times in this essay, but it feels like the question that's always, or that is very often navigated around in conversations about poetry, that, my kingdom for a poetry culture in which what mattered was that you were exposed to something and then you liked it, that seems so alien to the way we deal with poetry. And it is what, insofar as an anthology might be like an allergy test for students, that's where, Starnino's sort of partisan approach, I can understand it. I don't totally endorse it, but I get it, in that if he, his belief is that when the poetry he's talking about, the poetry that he seems to advocate, promoting in this sort of way, is poetry that if people were to be exposed to it, they would like it.
Yes, that's right. And that's a really good point. And I do believe that we're all born with poetry in our souls, and it's reflected in the fact that as very tiny children, we respond to song. We reproduce song before we understand what it means. My little granddaughter sings Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She has no idea what that means. And she loves poetry. I mean, that's ultimately, so it gets killed out of us. And it's because we are not exposed to it in a way that makes it continue to be fun. And what cheers me up is that I actually believe that everybody loves poetry because everybody loves music. It's just that for most people, the only way they love poetry is through music. And I would prefer that more of our culture could be not denigrating music at all, because it goes straight to the heart in a way that a lot of times poetry doesn't. But that it's a related joy, but it's a separate joy, and that you need people who think it's fun to teach you to expose it so that you continue to think it's fun. And then this thing that none of us understand, which is, why is it that even if a poem makes us very sad, we want to read it again and read it again? And I think for me, that's more true of poetry and drama than of other genres. I mean, how many times can we see there? Pretty much infinitely. And
sorry, your audio clipped slightly just there. But
sorry.
You were saying
I said, how many times can we see King Lear? Pretty much infinitely. We'll hear something different every time, and it's partly because it's in poetry, but it's also because we are stirred up, and we are, it's this pity and fear. It's the catharsis that we want. And Wordsworth talks about this in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, about the pleasure we get in things well said, and that in itself redeems so much of what is painful. And so I often feel that if people don't have that, if they can't meet pain with the pleasure of poetry, that is one resource that is, to me, essential anyway, that I feel others ought to have. I know this is to some degree partisan, truly, because I know there are mathematicians who feel that about math. That if you can't really appreciate math, you miss something about what it is to be human, and they're probably right.
They're certainly right. Just like if you've never given birth, and I clearly have not and never will, and that's also true for plenty of women. But and if you've never gone to war, there are plenty of experiences that if you haven't done them, you are missing part of what it is to be human. But that's also part of the beauty of literature, is it can give you a glimpse.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And and it's a glimpse, and that's the other thing about poetry that ought to make it more popular than it is. If we do have only time for a little TikTok, then we do have time for a little haiku. It's too bad that we don't necessarily go there. So the problem with anthologies too is that in their effort to give the reader many alternatives, all of them pleasurable, they can seem like a weight that is too heavy to bear. That, I look at all this stuff I don't know. And I feel it, I don't know about you, I feel it sometimes going into bookstores or large libraries where I'm excited to go. That's why I'm there. And then I'm there and I suddenly feel overwhelmed by what I'm never going to read. And you can't dwell in that. But I can see why some people looking at anthologies would feel that way, that this is effectively a huge library in front of me and I can't do it all.
Yeah. And there's a disadvantage to, as Sternino says, to presenting your dissent or your decision or whatever it is in the poems of someone else. And that's, I think that we lose a little bit of the motive of writing I don't know. I mean, I hope that no sane poet has ever written a poem hoping for it to be taught and explained in class, though that's probably not true. It should be true.
Alas, I think somebody's done it.
God, yeah, I fear. But that ought to be the case, at least, that poets sit down to write poems in order to give other people a pleasure, a thrill, or make them cry, or make them remember something, cut themselves shaving, as Houseman would say. But I think what we all have experience with are teachers who have an intention other than that, who have an intention to improve us, to edify us, to supply us, to equip us for something. And so, unfortunately, it's not the poets who have chosen these poems as their weapons, it's the teachers. Do you have I think it's probably impossible to teach thoughtfully and not have misgivings about it, but as somebody who's had a very thorough education and also provided others with education for a long time, do you, and is this your last semester teaching?
Yes.
Yes. So do you have any long view wisdom on the difficulties of teaching, or the compromises, or the despair, or whether that's writing or just poetry or anything?
Well, the phrase that I always come back to is "fit audience though few." I just want to hope that we here's another, we band of brothers. We few, we happy few. I mean, that those of us who love this stuff, we are very few, and we are fewer, I think, proportionately anyway, than we used to be in my grandparents' era, let's say, when everybody read poetry in school. But I guess what gives me hope is that it's not just that I get to pass on whatever wisdom I've got. It really is that young people being exposed to poetry are going to see it differently than they're going to press it farther than I can. That young people writing right now, I may not live to see something that they write in 50 years, but they're going where, because we know historically that has been the case, that many poets who we now think of as just as essential and canonical were pretty radical when they were writing. And I'm not talking about, formal radicalism necessarily. It can be an approach to what it is to be human. I mean, we are embarked on a very different sense of what that is in our cyber culture, and who knows? I know that I can't envision it, but I do believe that some of the poets who are being taught in universities, whether by me or by others, are going to do something that is better than I can project, that I can even imagine. I have to believe that, while also lamenting the decline of rhetoric everywhere, the decline of any sense, what syntax or grammar or anything else is. And as you say, the decline of an interest in audience. It's ironic, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Hollywood is and television are the primary ways in which we hear stories, and they are meant for mass audience. And most of us who love poetry love that too, love, very popular films. And yet that seems so clear that the people who are successful in Hollywood are doing it because they reach many people. But somehow in the poetry world, seems to me far too few people who are really thinking about their audience.
I think that's true. I even think of in the various, most of my degrees are in drama. So, and like a refrain among my various teachers and people I worked with was that they didn't want to make plays that were like TV, which is understandable for one.
Yes,
the things plays can do, they're not like TV. But what it ended up meaning very often was a sort of an arbitrary reaction. That in a way they were making theater that was derivative of TV by making it anti-TV. And of course,
interesting.
Love or hate TV. When it's good, it's not being good because it's trying to be TV. It's good because it's trying to tell a story well, and it's
Right.
reaching for the readiest tools, to achieve that. What I hadn't thought about, but of course makes perfect sense, is that, as you said, you will have students, and they will probably not even be students you would be able to name at the time, but who will see other possibilities and will go in other directions. And if there's one thing we know about education, it's that you can almost guarantee that the lesson that a really good student will learn is not going to be the lesson that the teacher was attempting to teach.
Exactly.
Whatever you're aiming to teach, you will spin your students off in God knows what direction. Maybe even just to spite you.
Right. That's part of it too. I mean, that's part of what children do with their parents. They are both, they use us as models, and they also use us as foils. And I also feel somewhat optimistic about poetry because we have more ways of getting it out there. I mean, if it were only books of poems and there were no other way to get it out, that would really be a problem. And I'm delighted that there's a world in which you and I get to publish actual books of poems. But there are other ways that people read poetry, and it is more democratic that way, and it's good. People break all sorts of copyright rules and print your poem in some weird way, forget to, they don't put it in stanzas anymore, whatever. It's getting out there, and that's good. I wanted to go back, though, to something you mentioned, which was that Yeats Anthology of Modern Verse. And no, I was just thinking about how wrong-headed great poets and anthologists can be. And isn't it marvelous that Yeats, who we love, could be so wrong and not think that Wilfred Owen deserved a place. And who else was in that list? I'm just looking now.
Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, Dylan Thomas, Wilfred Owen, William Carlos Williams, Robert Frost. I mean, that's really funny. That is really funny. But he was kind of beginning to get kind of ornery by 1936. Yeats was becoming politically also a bit of a problem by then. Anyway, we can be wrong. It's okay. I mean, what he did was what I was asking my students to do. Just say what you like. Unfortunately, it was called Oxford Book of Modern Verse rather than Mr. Yeats's favorite poems, which is what it probably should have been called.
Do you think since arbitrary binding decisions across contexts seem always to be fruitful in this arena, do you think if you had guidelines for anthologies or anthologists, how Sternino seems to have an idea about how anthologies should be written. Do you have any proposals, or like a Pound, any list of don'ts?
Don't write too many footnotes. As we continue to work on these different editions, we defined more and more words. We had the glosses on in the margin defining words you can look up in the dictionary. I do think that historical and other kinds of factual footnotes are very helpful. But yeah, don't define words. That seems like a minor thing, but it's kind of important. If you're going to have biographies of the writers, have them be completely non-evaluative, just the fact. Right?
Yeah. Right.
Let the reader come freshly to the material. If they're interested in Yeats, they'll find out what he did with the Irish theater and what his mixed feelings about the revolution and everything. I mean, don't overinterpret. Write an anthology that explains exactly what your goals are and what your goals aren't. Did I say an anthology? I meant to say introduction.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's what I meant. Yeah. Write an introduction. And that covers a lot of ground. If for example, we decided that we would not have any translations except of Old English. So beyond that, we weren't going to include anything translated. And that left out a lot of wonderful stuff. But you got to stop somewhere. I guess if I look back to the 1983 version of the Norton, which is what I was working with when I and my friends put together the 1995 edition, those editors from 1983 were completely uninterested in questions of gender or race or anything. And as a result, they published almost entirely white males. That's one side. That's unfortunate. But we can go in the other direction too. And I think we did do a good job with the Norton, but I'm just saying, I don't think it's the role of anthologies to be counterfactual in that sense, to suddenly have 70% women, for example, when the historical record shows that most of them weren't publishing until at least the Renaissance, right? And not much after. So, I mean, be aware of the political value of what you're doing, but go easy with that too.
I mean, it seems like that's maybe one element of the job that illustrates how potentially thankless the whole enterprise is. I mean, I can think, I mean, I was thinking, talking with another poet the other day about like editing and reviewing, and maybe even like anthology editing in particular, are among the most thankless literary labors you can perform, because you will, if anyone notices that you did it at all, it will be because they think you fucked up. Like that
so true. You put it so well. It's exactly right. And corollary to that, if they're a poet, is and you fucked up because I'm not in there, right? And so I would just like to say, while I have the opportunity, I would like to thank all of the fine poets I know who I really admire. And for some reason or other, my co-editors and I could not fit them into the Norton. And I would like to thank all those people who never complained and never said, why not me? Because they understood that this is representative and not encyclopedic. And we can't do it. We can't represent all. And I have had so many regrets. And after each edition, about I read something and I think, oh, I wish I'd put that in there, but you can't. And so I'm just grateful for anybody who didn't complain.
Yeah, it hadn't even occurred to me, but there's got to be a little bit of, I'm sure it's you all friends, but there's got to be a little bit of professional envy of the editors who are covering only dead poets. There's a
yes. I used to tease my co-editor because she stopped in 1799, and it really,
makes the email inbox burden a little lighter.
That's right. Yeah, they're not cutting you in the Shakespeare is not cutting you in the street.
I thought about this question. I mean, I read this essay when it came out back in April, I guess it was. But I thought about the same kind of question because there's so much of it that I think you can argue with it, or you say, well, his definitions are not very clear, or some of this seems sort of crazy, like you couldn't really approach anthologies this way. But then, do you know Austin has a new essay in the LA Review of Books on meter?
No.
It's long, and I'm actually going to be talking with him about that on this podcast as well.
And what's the subject?
It's a sort of a long, hopefully dispositive take on the free versus meter wars.
Oh, good! I'll be very interested to read him on that.
He does a very good job. Very smart. Other friends of mine have already, had heated arguments with me about it, and I have lots of questions for him. But it sort of, I think about that essay a little bit the way I do with this one, which is, if you were to take all of its proposals as given and, like Kant, will that they be universal law, then that probably doesn't really hold up. But as with, I thought of this essay almost as being a kind of counterfactual anthology. Like it's not that this would really make for a good proposal for how anthology should be, but I'm glad he wrote it. Like I'm glad he wrote it almost as a modest proposal, that it needs to be sort of set forth. And I think Austin's is less perverse. It's a little more straightforward as an essay, but it has a little bit of that spirit to it. I think again, Borges he said he had trouble writing because he always had these elaborate plans for enormous novels or epics. And it wasn't until he came up with a trick, which was that he would imagine that the book he wanted to write already existed, and then he would write a summary of it. And then that would be his story. And it feels a little bit like there's a version of this that could have been like the life, the lifespanning master counterfactual anthology, but instead it was sort of, it was cleaner and maybe more fun and more effective just to write a 14-page essay instead.
Yeah, no, I like this, the spirit of it too. And at one point he says that Starnino says that creativity is by its nature counterfactual, and so what he's ultimately saying is, let's call the anthology itself a work of creativity. It is making something. It's making a vision of what poetry can be. And it's selecting the things that the anthologist doesn't wish it to be. And here are the things that he would like it to be. And it basically just says, so there, now discuss, right? The way you would with an exam. Here it is. Now you figure it out. And it'll be interesting whether anthologies, how they will change with time, because the real fact we have to deal with here is that we do have so many modes of communicating and so many people uploading their communications into those various modes that it may become more and more difficult to believe in anybody's wisdom. On the other hand, I don't know about you, but I think people generally, when they feel overwhelmed, they turn to someone they respect and they say, what do you think? Right. And so maybe that will never die. Maybe that turning to an anthology as a kind of teacher. And
I think that kind of, there will always be a desire for that kind of authority, especially in an educational context. It also makes me think about the sort of the other, or a very different model of anthology, which is something like the Writer's Almanac or Poetry Daily, which is like, it is an anthology. It's it's over time, and it's serialized, so it's always maybe its editor and its criteria are changing, but it is a selection. Yes. And it's in some ways suited to our distracted age, in that it says, just worry about this one right now. Just that, and that's not. Right. I think about that because I do read poems intermittently, as part of this podcast, and it's, in that sense, it is a kind of an anthology that I think about across time. Like at least this one thing is worth your attention right now. That I won't argue anything else except it's worth hearing this out.
But listen to this. Yeah, it becomes sort of an anthology of Matthew Smith's taste in the way that Garrison Keillor, if you listen to him for years, which I did, you that sounds like a poem he would like, and that's good. That's valuable too. And especially if, and I'm sure your listeners do trust you, or they wouldn't come back. They
are happy to listen because they know they will disagree. That's sometimes the case. That's the feedback.
That can be fun too. Right. Yeah. That can be fun too.
which I welcome as, who was it? Who's old Massachusetts? Barney Frank used to say that he knew of plenty of voters who voted for him out of spite. And he said, I love those voters too. I love all, I welcome all of them. Do you have I can't remember his name, John Banville's pseudonym he uses for his detective stories. Is it something John Black or something Black?
Yes, it is. And I just read one of his books, April in Spain. Yeah, I can't. Benjamin Black.
Benjamin Black. That's what it is. Yeah. Yeah, it makes me wonder if, and maybe we won't know. Maybe it'll have to be under a pseudonym. But as the respectable editor of the Norton, it makes me wonder if there's a perverse shadow anthology that you would at some point put forth. What would that, if you were to put forth an anthology that could ignore all of the good, sensible guidelines you've developed for the Norton, what would that?
That's fun. What fun! What a fun question that is. I can't remember. Is it called The Stuffed Owl? There's an anthology of the worst poems that the anthologist has ever seen. I would have fun doing that. I've spent my whole career trying to find good poems, and in the process, I've stumbled across some real dogs. So I think that's what I'd like to do.
And there is because there's something special about the Howler, right? That it's not good enough if it's just dull and bad and boring. It has to achieve in a way, like it had like C.S. Lewis has that argument against Manichaeanism. He says like, well, even what makes Satan, scary is that he has some of the qualities of goodness. Because if he weren't strong
Yes.
or what, so there's something about
Yes.
a really terrifically bad poem that has to have some virtues. Otherwise, it's not enough.
Right.
Yeah, I could see.
Yeah, no, you've actually given me a really fun project. As I'm facing retirement, this could be an interesting thing to work on.
No, I would love.
Maybe we could do it together. I'm sure you encounter some really bad ones.
And if it becomes too onerous, then you just pull a Starnino and you write an essay proposing that somebody do this. You set out some guidelines. You say, all right, good enough. You do it. I'm curious. My very first semester of college, I had an acting teacher who had just been fired in disgrace, but had in his contract a semester to go. So,
oh no,
his position is, there's small differences between that and yours, which is, retiring with great honors after many years of distinguished service. But in his case, part of what I enjoyed about him was that instead of just phoning it in or ignoring us, he sort of decided to throw out the syllabus and just teach the class the way he sort of had always wanted to teach it. And it was, in some ways, it was crazy, but it was also really, he threw caution to the wind in teaching us, and it made for kind of a wonderful. Can you give
some examples? How did he throw caution to the wind?
There were definitely people. It was not at his instigation, but there were definitely exercises he set up that involved people, myself included, taking a lot of clothes off in class, and he didn't step in. He didn't prevent that from happening. He did a sense.
This is not where I thought you were going.
No, well, it's with there was like small scale bloodshed, but nobody was really hurt, and it was basically fine. There was, I remember a woman who actually went on to be a really fine director, doing a sense memory exercise with him and just collapsing into like really severe emotional distress. But we were very worried for her at that point, but she seemed to be really moved by it. And kind of, it ended up being a thing that she referred back to in her work later. It was the kind of thing that you would feel, thinking like now, having had some teaching experience, I would like, it's the kind of thing I would like run screaming away from. You don't want to, but it was, he laid his hand, he basically had this sort of pseudo hypnotic routine where he laid his hands on this girl's shoulders and called up the specter of her absentee father. It was like really kind of borderline like psychoanalysis kind of stuff. It's all stuff that's sort of in the it's in the ballpark of a lot of acting exercises. This was just stuff taken to such an extreme degree. We did Meisner exercises where we would just repeat back and forth the same slightly altered phrases to each other for like hours.
Yeah.
In some cases they would get like really, or they would just be like really brutal assessments of each other's appearances that would just go on and on. We spent a lot of time throwing and catching beanbags, which is that's
probably the least hurtful thing you did. Sounds like.
Oh yeah, and after you do it for hours, it becomes kind of meditative. You begin to, it was a crazy class. I'm very glad I took it. I'm glad. I'm glad I happened to be in his orbit at that moment. But again, you're not. Thankfully, your situation is very different from his. But I wonder, are there any? Do you have any impulse to throw caution to the wind with your teaching this semester? Is there anything that you feel inclined to cut loose on that you might not have before? Or
unfortunately, and I'm not making a particular statement about Johns Hopkins, but unfortunately, it's impossible to throw caution to the winds today. You simply can't.
Right.
The kind of thing that your teacher did would just, he was already fired. He'd get fired again. Yeah. They would drag him out. There are so many things that we feel we can't say. And I mostly approve of the notion that the teachers are not psychotherapists, and they have to be very careful if they're bringing out psychologically sensitive material in class to really treat it. It's harder actually with acting, I think, than with poetry. But you really do have to talk about the speaker and not about the I, as if the writer is exactly the same as the I. And you have to do various things to protect people's right to speak in a way that isn't hurtful. But I mean, we are just so oversensitive about so many things now that I regret that about where teaching is going. I'm glad that we have certain boundaries that we didn't have. I'm glad that we don't talk about each other's appearance in a way that I remember, at the dawn of my teaching, the kinds of things I would say, or I would hug my students. I would say, "Oh, I just love your dress," or, all that stuff. That's gone. You just can't do that now. And there's just a lot you can't do that you would do out of affection, that you don't intend it to be aggressive in any way, but it may come across as that. So, no, my idea of throwing caution to the winds is letting them decide, what to write about. That's all I can do.
I do now. Now I want the since you do have I think mostly of you writing relatively short lyrics, but you do have a mode you take up from time to time of sort of the long discursive, either monologue or semi-narrative poem. I think of like the Surveyor's poem, which is such a strange sort of Mobius strip of a poem. Yeah, I kind of want either a dramatic monologue or a narrative poem about like what's the Yeats, nor is there singing school, but I kind of want like your singing school, like
that's interesting.
Like you could even do it the way the people used to, which is make it some damned figure who like take some figure who's already earned our disapproval, make it Humpert or somebody we already know he's bad, but then let him maybe be a genius at this certain kind of thing that we can't. The kind of teaching that maybe would be great if poets could have this kind of teaching, but they can't.
Yes. And I love academic satire. I think there's no way I could write about such things in the way you're describing without at least attempting to be funny. There's something just
of course, please,
hilarious about academia generally. I just read Richard Rousseau's 1998 academic satire, Straight Man. And apart from the fact that basically the internet hardly existed in 1998, he had it down. It's hilarious, and it's really, really true. But you're right. I do like writing more narrative and discursive things. And I wanted to mention that in my new book coming out, I have a long, very counterfactual poem called Island Diaries, in which poor Prospero is walking along the beach, and this guy runs up behind him, and it's Robinson Crusoe. And so they both thought they had the island to themselves, and they have to get along. So that's my counterfactual contribution.
Is it called The Bliss of Solitude?
No, I very much had Elizabeth Bishop in mind. I knew I couldn't step on her toes too much, but no, it's called Island Diaries, and they're both telling stories through their diaries.
I look forward to that. I pre-ordered. I don't know when it's going to arrive, but it's sometime.
I'm sure that I can get an e-galley to you. That's what they do now, where they don't have galleys, they have e-galleys. So I'll make sure I can get one.
Yeah, no, I would love to read it. But I was just going to ask if you would read something to send us out.
Why don't I find something short? So this poem is the first poem in the book, but it makes it sound a little bit as if it's the last, because it's called Your Session Has Timed Out, and that title runs into the first line. Your session has timed out due to inactivity. Do you want to reboot back to your nativity? Too bad, you can't go back, or forward for that matter. Remember running track, dunking a basketball, or come to think of it, doing anything at all? Too bad. You can't reboot. In fact, the very terms you use will soon be moot, will take their downward spiral like you to a black hole while brave new words go viral. Assuming being active or inactive is a thing in the future, or to live.
That was my conversation with Mary Jo Salter. Again, her new book is Zoom Rooms. It is now available for pre-order. I will have a link in the show notes to that. That last poem, that poem she read at the end, is the first poem in Zoom Rooms. And again, I've heard her read several other poems from the collection, and they're really good. She's the rare combination of an extremely accomplished poet who is also a really, really delightful and basically well-adjusted human being who's pretty pleasant to be around. So I hope you did enjoy my conversation with her. I will have links to all of her stuff, including the Norton Anthology of Fucking Poetry, which is a real doorstopper, but is truly an essential part of your fucking library. So thank you to Mary Jo. Apologies to Carmine. Though again, reach out, say the word, come talk some shop, Carmine. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me as always at sleerickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.